Good afternoon to everybody. We are starting this webinar with the song Abre las Puertas, Open the Doors, a beautiful song by Maria Ruiz. Thank you for being here, and I would like to remind you that we have interpreting into English and Spanish today. And we're going to talk about Mediterranean policies and the southern neighborhoods. I would like to start this webinar by saying that we are extremely concerned by the bombings that have taken place in Palestine, Jerusalem, and the mosque, as well as the forced evictions in Fasad. This violence is extremely disproportionate and detrimental to Palestine. The EU has to condemn this barbaric acts. Human rights violations need to stop in Palestine. It's time to move from words to actions, and this is the only way to bring peace and justice. Very well. Today we are going to start talking about the southern neighborhood. The relationship between the EU and the southern neighborhood faces many challenges. On the 10th anniversary of the Arab uprising and the 21st anniversary of the Barcelona process, we need to take stock of the situation and put forward a new agenda for the Mediterranean. And that is the title of the series of webinars we've organized, to rethink the relationship. On the 23rd of March, we held a first seminar, and we looked back on the past 25 years of southern neighborhood policies with different tools since the Barcelona process. And we also looked at the state of the southern neighborhood, and we've seen many changes since the Arab Springs. In the region, we've seen a clear fight for the resources, the militarization of the borders, and of course, we've seen how migrants have been criminalized and commercial ties with the EU have been strengthened. However, we see that oftentimes green transition, the defense of social movements, feminism, and the culture of peace, and frozen conflicts such as in Sahara, Palestine, and Kurdistan are left aside. We also need to think of the meaning of the Euro-Mediterranean relationship. In our political group, we strive for a more equal relationship, and we need to leave aside false dilemmas between security and stability and human rights and democracy. We are going to talk about several topics with many experts in the region and representatives of the civil society. This will be an open space for your questions and thoughts. Today, we inaugurate the second webinar in this cycle, A Mediterranean for People's Rights. Up to now, the neighborhood policy has considered their relationship as a strictly economic one. The southern neighborhood is seen as an attractive place for investors where investments rely on previous reforms. The human rights approach is linked to an economic development and to security policies that are designed to stop migrations and human mobility. And as we know, this is a right. All of this makes an unsustainable situation permanent. It makes the Mediterranean and the Sahel into mass graves where nobody is rescued. This falls upon border communities such as Lesbos and the Canary Islands. We need to manage mobility with a comprehensive approach based on human rights, and we can't leave this in the hands of extremist groups that are spreading reactionary ideas in the EU. We need a new roadmap for the Mediterranean, and that means withdrawing the support to regimes that are an obstacle to political change. It must listen to demands for more social justice from the population. In this respect, we see two key actors for change for the Euro-Mediterranean policy. First of all, women's movements in the southern neighborhood. They are caught up in wars, conflicts, punishment, sexual violence, but they also suffer at the hands of foreign military interventions that push many groups in the countries towards reactionary ideas. Feminism has been key for the expansion of rights around the world. It must also be key in the Mediterranean. On the other hand, we need to protect human rights defenders. We need to stress that stifling protest is an alarming global trend. In the Arab world, as I said, this means withdrawing support for regimes that violate human rights and repress activists. In conclusion, the Euro-Mediterranean process glossed over political, human, social, and gender rights. The time has come to shine light on the social agenda, particularly on labor rights and gender equality, as well as including migration rights, leaving behind the current securitization approach. And that's why we have our experts here today. We have Ernest Utasun, MEP from Catalonia and Commune. We've got his Vice President of the Greens EFA, Humana Haddad, Lebanese writer, journalist, and human rights activist. We have also Elena Maleno, writer, journalist, and human rights activist for Migrants, and Maha Abdallah, International Advocacy Officer for the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. Thank you very much for being here today, and good afternoon. Without further ado, we will give the floor to Ernest. We are, as we said, taking stock of this 25 years of Southern policy and neighborhood policy. We've mentioned the importance of women's rights and migration's rights. How do you think we can include this in a new agenda for the Mediterranean, Ernest? Thank you very much, Idoia, and thank you very much to the International Secretariat of Podemos for inviting me here today. And thank you to Humana, Elena, and Maha for being here with me. All my best to Elena in particular. I hadn't seen her in a long time. And I also want to show my support for the astounding work that she's carried out before our very eyes. I will now try to reply to this question. We know the Euro-Mediterranean partnership is in a crisis since 1995, since the declaration of Barcelona. We've seen that on paper, this is a very beautiful declaration, but many things have happened since then, and not all of them have been good or for the better. Things have moved, but not always in the direction we would have hoped for. Since 1995, many things have happened. In 2004, the neighborhood policy was launched. This was a pillar. Then we created this permanent secretariat in the city of Barcelona. And in 2011, we saw a shift in the approach of the neighborhood policy in the light of the Arab Spring, so that this approach could be based a bit more on human rights, freedom of expression, etc. These were key elements for this partnership. Having said that, the relationship of the EU with the southern neighbors has been marked by a regression of trying to go back how things were after the Arab Spring. The neighborhood policy was also reviewed again in 2015. A lot of emphasis was put on economic development, security, and human rights were all again on the background. If we look at priorities, we can see that the EU has maintained bilateral relationships with these countries, and we can see the human rights agenda is really not present. So we have to be critical to how we've tried to adapt very quickly to new situations in the EU. I think this started with the participation of the EU in the Cairo summit, and that was the sign that the EU was ready to adapt. I don't know, in April, the Council has started talking about this new agenda for the Mediterranean, and I think we have a lot to say. We have a lot of proposals to put forward to improve things. And I would like to talk about some things we do need to correct in the short term. First of all, and this is key, we need to talk about what type of socioeconomic relationship we want to have with our southern neighbors. The EU has signed trade agreements that have been completely unequal and unfair with these countries. So this partnership has not fostered sustainable development. On the contrary, they haven't contributed to the necessary human development that would have led to a more equal relationship. And there's something that the EU always forgets about, and I think is one of the main priorities. We've completely forgotten about going beyond flagship initiatives. In no way has gender equality been a priority. We keep hearing about it, but there is clear inequality in the southern border, and yet that has never been a true priority for our agenda, and it really should be. And then we have the more complex issue and the most worrying issue, and that is cooperation in migration. And here I would like to stress something. This new pact on migration is really based on securitization of borders, and this is worrying. And we've seen how right-wing groups in the EGP have really tried to link European cooperation and border controls, and that is not cooperation with the Mediterranean. We're also talking about the whole of Africa. They're trying to link all sorts of cooperation with stopping migration. And this is what worries most our leaders when we talk about cooperating with the South. And this is highly worrying. Our cooperation policy with the South, I would say, is criminal. It does not follow international law, and it has only got worse in the past few years. So this is one of the big challenges going forward. And there's another element that concerns me. There is a new concern around democratic regression and about the shrinking space for societies in these countries. The EU is not really concerned about that. We've seen how there's the space for development of civil society is shrinking, and that space, that shrinking space, should be one of the main concerns of the EU, and it should provide support to civil society organizations, because those organizations help societies be democratic and free, and this is absolutely not a priority at the moment. So I think the priorities nowadays are wrong, and we have a lot of work to do if we want to go back to the principles that inspired the Barcelona Declaration in 1995. I think we also need to think about how we want to officialize our relationships. What do I mean by this? Last time we tried to have a big cooperation. We created the Union for the Mediterranean, and that boiled down to a secretariat in Barcelona. Of course, cooperation there is really positive. However, it doesn't have a political dimension of the magnitude we would need. We can't really say that we've got a multilateralism that works to tackle today's problems. So there's one thing we can say on this 25th anniversary of the Barcelona Declaration. We need to get our ambition back, but we need to change our political priorities. We've seen there's been an aggression since the Arab Spring. So these are some of the thoughts I wanted to share with you today, and I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you very much, Ernest. He was saying the Mediterranean has been on a crisis over the past 25 years, that the neighborhood was launched as a pillar and then it was made over again, and that the human rights agenda is severely lacking. We've seen that the southern border is extremely unequal, partly because the free trade agreement are extremely unfair. And that's why we strive for a new, brave agenda that is vibrant. I wanted to remind all participants that you can send your questions using the chat. You will see, not the chat, the Q&A section that you will see on the bottom part of the screen. Without further ado, I'll now give the floor to Humana Haddad. She is a Lebanese writer, journalist, and human rights activist, and she is going to tell us more about the situation of women and feminism in Lebanon and some notes on the Arab world. What do they ask of European policies so that women can have more rights? You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Idoia. First of all, thank you very much for this kind invitation to this webinar. It is both a pleasure and an honor to participate. And just to start, since we're talking about women and feminism, allow me to say something that you might know, but I always have the need to repeat this. There are so many wrong stereotypes about the Arab women in the Western countries that sometimes I think that people do prefer those prejudices to reality. We are not weak, defenseless, or at least many of us aren't like this. We have powerful brains and we are using them. This is just to tell you that feminism is making its way in our region, even if it might seem to be the opposite. And this is the crux of the matter. When I tell you that the feminist movements are thriving in our region, I don't want to say necessarily that we have reached that point where we want to achieve the changes that we deserve and that we need so much. What I really want to say is that we are reaching a new maturity in the awareness raising, thanks to the social media platforms, alternative channels, and the democratization of dialogue. This has been possible through internet, and now there are many more Arab women than ever that are aware that something really wrong is happening in the way in which our societies are treating us. More and more Arab women are getting involved in the fight for a more equalitarian society. More Arab women than ever are participating today in this new wave of revolutions. Ernest talked about the Arab Spring, the Arab uprising, and now we are seeing a new round, a new wave of spring as we are witnessing in the region. from the Lebanon, my region, to Algeria, going through Sudan, we see these revolts, this new awareness of what is unjust and what is wrong for our societies. And we have very strong feminist demands. And these are the first relevant steps towards the transition and the transformation that we want to achieve. The goal is that our dignity and our rights are respected. But having said this, the way ahead of us is a long one. We still live in a part of the world where young girls are forced to get married, where feminine genital mutilation exists, where there are rules and legislation that controls divorce and the custody of children, and these respond to religious beliefs. And there are patriarchal societies still where sexual harassment is impugned, or where refugees are targets of prostitution networks, or foreign domestic workers are abused. And there are the so-called crimes of honor, and where general attitudes and customs are plagued with a poisonous dose of macho feelings and double standards. The journey is long indeed, and it is so not only in Lebanon and the Arab region, but generally everywhere in the world. The pandemic that hit us so hard this past year, and the increasing levels of domestic violence that accompanied it universally, not to mention the high pressure that women employees had to endure since they had to do telework and they had to struggle in juggling with their kids, the domestic chores and their jobs, everything at the same time. All this proved to us that feminism still has a very important role to play all over the world. But if you ask now a group of Arab feminists, what are the priorities to improve the situation of women, then it is very likely that you would get different responses from each of them. And it's not because we are not agreeing on the same points, but it is because there are so many equally pressing issues, whether they are of economic nature or legal or social or educational or political. All of them are priorities. In my case, if I had to choose, my first priority would be to fight to make sure that more women, and most of all feminist women, get involved in politics. And it's not just because very few male politicians could understand the problems of feminist women, but it is mostly because it is our absolute right to participate in the government of the country and the shaping of its policies, because we are half of society. But let's take Lebanon, my country, as an example. There are only 6 women in the parliament, a parliament composed of 128 MPs, and this is the reality in 2021. Once upon a time, a few years ago, our then Prime Minister decided to be kind enough to appoint a secretary for women's affairs. And guess what? He gave that portfolio to a man. This happened in the Lebanon, not in a country such as Sweden, for example, where perhaps, and I insist, perhaps it wouldn't be some lack of respect. So how can we possibly get to a better place, talking about our rights, if those who really care about our rights aren't involved in the process and in the dialogues? Well, for this reason, I am convinced that all efforts should focus on achieving a better female representation in politics. And when I say feminine, I truly mean it. I mean feminist, because not all female politicians, unfortunately, consider these issues as a priority in their career. In fact, I noticed that many women tend to evade representing their gender once they occupy an office in politics, as if that would diminish their credibility in the political sphere. They don't want to be a woman talking about women's issues. Well, we do need women talking about women's issues. And most of all, we need a ministry for equality in Lebanon and in each and every Arab country. Therefore, if European policies in the Mediterranean should focus on just a single thing in the whole Arab world, it should be, in my humble opinion, on this precise issue. And I have already prepared a proposal for such a ministry in Lebanon, but I haven't presented it because honestly, no one in power nowadays would give it any kind of attention. Yes, fixing our crumbling economy is important. I'm talking about Lebanon, I insist. We need to mend our broken social security system. This is very important, as it is lowering our high level of unemployment rate. But so are equally important our rights, our dignity, and our role as women. And we won't be intimidated any longer into shutting up only because so many other things need fixing in our countries. Just to sum up in one sentence, we will not wait anymore. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Humana. It was very important to highlight the fact that we in the Western countries have preconceived ideas of the stereotype of an Arab woman, and we do see that feminism is thriving in the region, although we sometimes think it is the opposite. We see now that feminist movements are thriving in your region. There's new waves of revolts, of revolutions with powerful women in the front line, and the importance to have women involved in the front line of politics, as you told us, of the 128 MPs, so few of them are women. It is important that women get empowered and they are involved in politics, in feminist policies from the first line. We're going to listen now to Elena Maleno, very well known in our country, a writer, journalist, and activist for human rights of migrants. She has suffered the harassment and prosecution and criminalization by the fact of defending human rights. So we're talking about the rights of migrants and the Canary Island route that we are now seeing more intensely. How do you think that would be the best policies boosted from the European Union to have a real and just migratory policy that takes into account human rights of migrants? Hello. Yes, I lost the connection, and that was exactly when you were asking me that question. Yes, that's why I was asking. Yes, I don't know what happened. I lost the connection momentarily. Yes, well, I was just saying that you were going to be the next speaker, that you are very well known in Spain as activist and advocate of the rights of migrants. You yourself have been persecuted and harassed by being an advocate of human rights and the rights of migrants. So the question was, from your opinion, from your point of view, what would be the best policies from the European Union to get close to a fair border policy based on human rights? Well, as Ernest said at the beginning, the past 25 years have meant that we went backwards in the relationships in the Mediterranean region, because one of the main bases of that relationship was controlling movements. Externalizing borders was strengthened, and the relationships that we have with many third countries are based, as you said, in militarizing these relationships. That's why, in a very preserved way, they use cooperation to development. So they use this cooperation to development with the aim that such donations are also used to put a break to those movements. At the same time, there is a higher militarization, and this has a clear impact in those countries at the other side of the Mediterranean. And we see this impact on a day-to-day basis, for example, with the purchasing of military material to control movements. And I can give you a very clear example: violence against women. When Europe is doing this, it is attacking different collectivities through these raids. In raids, sexual violence against women is used as a war weapon in this border context. This externalization has had a very big impact in those countries. It has increased racism and xenophobia in those territories. It has had a terrible impact in community law. For example, the right to free circulation, and it has had an impact in the standards of human rights. So Europe hasn't only promoted human rights standards, but it is also the responsible one in the fact that some human rights decreased their standards in the region. And this is so because there are economic interests above everything. Who is going to dare to do policies when there are huge economic interests that have to do with controlling movements? This is one of the big business of the 21st century. So where are those armament industries that have invested so much? Those arms industries that provokes the expelling of citizens, millions of citizens from places, from countries such as Syria. Well, those are the same people that find yet another business in blocking the movement of those people that have been expelled from their territories. And we need to say this loud and clear. Salvini's policies, unfortunately, are no different at all from the policies of other parties that call themselves left parties. Salvini is quite rude in his narrative, but the implementation of control of movements is the same in all the European governments, just the same everywhere. In fact, the Spanish state is one of the pioneers of these policies of externalizing borders that started 30 years ago, and in the past 25 years, they have increased their power and their presence in the relationships in the whole area. So who is going to dare face those companies, those industries that do lobby in the European Parliament and that are becoming also involved in the business? So what are the politicians? Well, the politicians that are going to be brave enough to recognize that with these policies, they are doing a new colonization through the swing doors in Mije. There are soldiers, European soldiers, or patrollers in the seas of Mauritania and Senegal. And they just want to control movements. This is a new colonization that is having its presence in the military. And it protects the interests of companies that are expelling citizens, because I'm not only talking about the armament industries, but also the fishing agreements with Macron in France is expelling the young Senegalese boys and girls that are forced to leave their countries. And they're protecting the interests of predator companies, and in many cases they are European companies. That's why we say that we need to focus on the borders. And we have important reports, such as the reports from the Transnational Institute, that say that there is a border war. It is a low-intensity war where there is a very important investment of armament industries. They are letting die certain collectivities, women sexually abused, attacks to migrant children. This is generating money. Not only that, it is promoting a narrative that hides the business itself, the narrative of racism, and not only social racism, but also institutional racism that is also present in the welcome systems. And we are denouncing what is happening in the Canary Islands. This is yet another example of the institutional racism that exists in the Spanish state. So all of these examples of racism is hiding and defending this European system of borders control. And this is precisely what we want to explain to the European citizen. And this is what is allowing the continuation of negotiations and more money being generated. At the same time, they are killing or letting die many people at this border war. And as you said before, there has been another problem with the safety and security of migrants, and among the advocates of migrants in the border. Europe actively prosecutes, or Europe actively is persecuting women defenders of human rights. We need to say this loud and clear, and Frontex is doing this, European agency to control borders, as you very well said. My case is an example of the prosecution of those of us that raised our voices against that European necro policy. And they tried to shut us up. In my case, it was through legal procedures using reports of the Spanish police and police that controls borders. These reports were sent to Morocco to make sure that they had the collaboration of the Moroccan police.
In my case, they were asking for a life sentence when all I was doing was to defend life. So we need to bring awareness to this. There are many great economic interests at the border, and that means defending life gets more and more difficult. We need to be deeply committed to anti-racism. That is a key priority, and anti-racism is not just about virtue signaling. We want the discourse to be a reality within the institutions. They need to be anti-racist on an institutional level, because we are seeing racism in European governments, and we need to defend life. We can't normalize people losing their lives because of crossing a border. And we need to free cooperation from this perverse relationship of migration control. We need to release them. We need to release people from the control of the Ministry of Home Affairs around Europe. We've seen situations in Lesbos where rights have been sequestered. We've seen it in Melilla, and we see it right now on the Canary Islands. Relations need to be free from this movement control, this mobility control. And we want to be able to talk about a Europe that defends life and that enforces policy, that puts an end to this policy of death, this necropolitics. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. I forgot to mention that before. Well, thank you, Elena, for being here with us today. And thank you for all the work that you carry out and have been carrying out for so many years. As you said, it's really important to point out how externalization borders has an impact on violence on women, such as sexual violence. Europe is responsible for this regression in human rights around the world. We need to point out this economic interests that benefit from controlling free movement of people, and how weapons and interest in weapons result in forced evictions. And you also mentioned how alleged left-wing governments actually carry out quite reactionary policies. You said that we need to have an anti-racist discourse that is brave, that is based on human rights, so that we can have cooperation that is free from border control. Very well. I will now give the floor to Maha Abdallah, who is the International Advocacy Officer for the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. Good afternoon, Maha. We would like to have an overview of the situation of human rights defenders in Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Palestine, Syria, and Yemen. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and for the organizers of the event. I'm really honored to take part in this, especially with such brilliant panelists. I will interrupt the flow of the event by speaking in English, but I'm confident that the brilliant interpreters will deliver the messages very, very well. And to start with, the overall human rights situation in the Mediterranean and the region, unfortunately, remains characterized by ongoing violations, repression, and attacks, including against those who dare to raise their voices, calling for freedom, dignity, social justice, and human rights. And these have been by different oppressive, authoritarian, and colonialist authorities and regimes that are present in the region. And while it won't really be possible for me today to present a detailed analysis of this, I am hoping that with the overview, which shows many overlapping elements across the different countries, will help us understand what human rights defenders face on the ground in some parts of the Mediterranean, and accordingly help fix the priorities in the relationship between Europe and the southern neighborhood, and to put it in the right direction as we all hope it to be. To start with, in Palestine, and where currently Israel has escalated its ongoing aggression against Palestinians, especially as we see in Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, and which comes as part of its long, widespread, and systematic attacks against the Palestinian people, human rights defenders and Palestinian civil society more broadly have endured systemic intimidation, including death threats, physical assaults, arbitrary arrests, cyber attacks, travel bans, residency revocation, and deportation, all being done in an attempt to restrict civic space, delegitimize, and silence them. In the past 6 years specifically, the Israeli government, through the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs and associated allegedly non-governmental groups, have intensified their smear campaigns and harassment against Palestinian human rights organizations and defenders, especially in light of the proceedings at the International Criminal Court in relation to the situation in Palestine. The Israeli government and associated groups have been also increasingly pressuring international donors with a primary focus on the European Union and member states and institutions to cut off their sources of funding to Palestinian organizations and defenders. Such Israeli orchestrated tactics have also targeted human rights organizations and defenders in the occupied Syrian Golan and international organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. Meanwhile, if we look at Yemen, and against the backdrop of an ongoing war for 7 years, the worst man-made humanitarian crisis, and continued serious violations and crimes committed by all parties to the conflict, whether domestic, regional, or international, human rights defenders and activists are subjected to threats, intimidation, movement restrictions, detention, enforced disappearances, and to forms of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. Women human rights defenders particularly face repression by all parties to the conflict because of their gender and for their work on women's rights. Cyber attacks, incitement, defamation, bullying, and death threats are also some features to attacks against women human rights defenders across Yemen. In Syria, unfortunately, the scene is not much different. In a context of conflict for more than 10 years, human rights defenders have faced violent crackdowns since 2011. Already, human rights defenders had faced significant difficulties to do their work under Assad's repressive regime, and have since 2011 been at an even greater risk of direct targeting and persecution, including through arbitrary arrest, detention, malicious prosecution, death threats, restrictions on their freedom of movement, abduction, defamation, and other forms of harassment and intimidation. At the same time, non-state actors that have been involved in the Syrian conflict have increasingly employed tactics of intimidation, death threats, abduction, and detention against human rights defenders in Syria. As for the situation of human rights defenders and civil society in Egypt, it is unsurprisingly extremely difficult, considering that the public sphere and civic space have been tightly closed, with freedoms of expression, association, and assembly crushed. The Egyptian authorities' crackdown on human rights defenders has been carried out through threats and attacks, enforced disappearances, prolonged pretrial detention, and the systemic charges of spreading false news and links to terrorist groups, all of course without any credible evidence. During forced disappearances and detention, human rights defenders in Egypt are subject to physical, sexual, and psychological abuse and torture. Detention conditions are usually awful, to say the least, without adequate to access lawyers or to relatives, to adequate healthcare, to sanitary conditions. Some are subjected to prolonged solitary confinement without due cause, not to mention violence and abuse. There is also an increasingly visible pattern of reprisals against human rights defenders for attempting to participate in multilateral human rights fora, including with UN bodies, with diplomats, and the international community. And this is not only, of course, strictly exclusive to Egypt. We see this pattern happen in other parts of the region as well. Meanwhile, when we look at Libya, human rights defenders are subjected to both a restrictive legal framework that imposes arbitrary restrictions on them, with laws in place that criminalize freedom of expression and subjects human rights defenders to prosecution through unfair military trials. This is in addition to various degrees of attacks and obstructions from state-affiliated armed groups, including religious radical groups. The result of this, all independent civil society, including human rights defenders and women human rights defenders, are constantly at risk of being targeted by armed groups through assassinations, kidnappings, threats, arbitrary arrests, interrogations, and raids on their homes and workplace. This comes in a context of impunity, which is a direct result of an absent functioning judicial system constantly targeted by militias in Libya. In the east of Libya particularly, threats to women human rights defenders are severe. They are subject to assassination attempts, arrests, and other forms of attacks, including gender-based violence, which forces them to withdraw from the public sphere and undermines their work incredibly. Similarly, in Algeria, we see human rights defenders operate in a repressive legal environment, with some articles in the penal code criminalizing public freedoms, including the freedom of speech, peaceful assembly and association, as well as the very restrictive 2012 law on civil society organizations. These restrictions have taken a new dimension since the start of the Hirak movement in February 2019 and again in February 2021, which human rights defenders have joined popular protests and have been violently arrested and increasingly prosecuted under charges like incitement or for allegedly conspiring against the state or for alleged terrorism charges. We should also note and mention that in Algeria, as well as across the region in its entirety, LGBTQI human rights defenders suffer even a heavier burden in their work. This is an overview, a very, very brief overview without cases, without the names of human rights defenders from all these different parts, but I hope that it's sufficient. But before I stop, I want to emphasize the fact that in all of the countries that I covered today and probably beyond in the region, there is a prevailing culture of impunity where perpetrators of violations and even crimes at times escape liability. And instead of being held liable, they are allowed to acquire more power and authority through such tactics that target civil society. And this is a key issue that must be addressed by the EU in its relationships with governments across the regions, including in the economic, trade, cooperation, and diplomatic relationships and at all levels. to uphold human rights, human dignity, and end impunity. This is, of course, needed if there is a serious and genuine political will. The EU should therefore need to make sure that these relationships and programs are not incentivizing or contributing to the myriad of violations and crimes being committed in the region, including against human rights defenders. The EU needs to also make sure that the agency remains vested in the people on the ground and listen carefully to their demands and aspirations. I will stop here, but I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maha, for this presentation. You started with Palestine and you talked about how Israel has attacked Gaza and Palestine and how this has escalated from the Israeli government and how this has had an impact on human rights defenders. I would also add here, under the inaction of the international community, they haven't done anything to stop the Israeli government. You also talked about how women human rights defenders in Syria are especially persecuted with state agents, with militias, etc. You've also talked about restrictive legal framework and how women defenders can be taken to court for their work. You talked about this framework of impunity that has allowed for these attacks on human rights defenders to continue, and how political will from the EU and diplomacy can help. Thank you very much to all panelists. If you agree, we will move on to the question and answer round. And I would like to encourage our viewers to write questions. We are going to do several rounds and we're going to group some questions and you can go ahead and reply. We have some more specific ones and more general ones. First question: what can parliamentary groups, the left, the Greens, to make sure that human rights and migrant rights are respected, and so that the humanitarian element is more important than the securitarian element? Should we change the meaning of security so that the right-wing parties don't prevail? Security also means being able to live freely in a world free of gender-based violence. What do you think of the current concept of security? We also have some questions about migration. The EU and Spain values the relationship with Mediterranean countries, and I think traditionally policy has been based on the economy. How can we counteract this, and what are your proposals? Could we not open EU representation offices in the southern neighborhood countries so that they can deal with migration applications? How can we establish a relationship between both sides of the Mediterranean? Do you think we can change this unequal cooperation model if the EU has done the same thing within their own northern and southern cooperation? This is our first block. Who wants to break the ice? Ernest. Okay, well, maybe I can't answer to all questions, but I'll try with some. So how can we defend migrants' rights in Europe? I think we've been working on some proposals for quite some time. And we've been working on the migration and asylum pact and policy in the EU. There is a first element we need to acknowledge. European migration policies, they violate international law. That needs to be said. So the first thing we need to do is to make sure international law is respected. And this is a very wide concept. We have the 51 Refugee Convention.
This is a convention that has been massively violated at the border. We have recent scandals as the hot rejections with the actions of Frontex in Greece, for example, and this is illegal. The Convention of the Statute of the Refugee defends them and forces the member states to analyze on a case-by-case basis all the demands of asylum that reach the border. And what happens in the Mediterranean, as we said before, is a clear violation of the right of the sea. There's an obligation to rescue. And in the case of Libya, the Europeans recognized an area that is not so. And this is how Frontex is acting in the sea. So there are systematic violations of the right of the sea, and we need to wake up because the right is on our side, the legislation is on our side, and the law is on our side. And about the concept of security, safety and security. Yes, I agree. Security being understood as something much more broad. And we mix here human security with other factors. Human security is also the fight against climate change and its effect. This is devastating part of the countries, and this is the reason why many people feel obliged to leave their country. So this concept needs to be broadened, and we need to defend this as a broad concept that agglomerates many rights. And about the agencies at the origin, we don't really need agencies at the origin because they all have consulates at the origin. Those consulates or embassies, if we had a good policy, then they would be channeling migratory fluxes, but they aren't doing so. Just to give you an example, one of our mistakes in Spain in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, just before the government between Zapatero and Rajoy, Zapatero eliminated the capacity to give asylum visas in our consulates. And this was an existing channel so that refugees could arrive at Spain before. This was changed during the socialist government of Zapatero, and the European Union criticized this very much. So as a refugee, you could ask for this asylum visa. This is no longer possible. And it is one of the tasks to do in the current government to go back to that asylum policy that recuperates some of the lost rights. So this is just for the first round of answers, questions and answers. And who is next? I can do it. Generally speaking, to the questions that mentioned migration within the territory, well, I think that there is a dichotomy between humanitarian and compassion. This is not a compassion policy, and this was the answer given by Europe. When there isn't a recognition of human rights, they talk about compassion policy. And facing the security concept, we need to reply with the human rights of any person in any territory, which means that rights shouldn't be perceived as privileges. Because at the end of the day, what we are finding in Europe is the Europe of privileges. And this is very clear. These privileges are being crumbled down. They're being crumbled down from the very institutions and from the powerful positions. The white privilege that needs to learn how to reconstruct itself. And this is not done from the north, from the privilege itself, but it is done with alliance, with the communities within the territories that do not have access to those rights. I think it is very important to see those movements that, for example, the movement that regularized citizens in Spain in the middle of the pandemic, because they were the most affected by the pandemic, those that had been enduring situations of slavery, answering to the needs of those who had the privilege to be confined. So we need to say loud and clear that those people that are coming from other countries, they do end up living situations of slavery in Europe. And if we want to deconstruct such privileges and believe on rights, then we need to establish an alliance with the South. We can't open up agencies of the European Union in third countries. We will have to start a dialogue with the third countries to find the best formula, to see what's happening down there and what is their proposal from the South. And as Ernest said, in the past, you could ask for asylum from the consulates, and this is no longer the case because the legislation was changed. So we need to follow this avenue and not to fall into a pornography of pain. In the humanitarian framework, we are talking about the other, sometimes through the pornography of pain. And at the end of the day, we are not rescuing the people. And when they do rescue the people, they need to see the people drowning themselves so as to save them, because in the Europe of privileges, unless they don't see a dying, drowning woman or child, they don't recognize a human being that is dying. This is what I call the pornography of pain. And there are many keys out there held by communities and people that do not share that space in the narratives. And from those keys, we need to establish something and construct something together. Thank you very much, Elena. Humana, Maja, I have questions addressed to you and also general questions. Humana, I see a very clear advance of women in the region, but my question is there any male movement? Do they advance even if at a slower pace? Whether they help the participation of women in politics? Thank you. The European Union, is it a priority to have the presence of women when negotiating with countries, or are there other factors to take into account? Thank you for your positive view of the situation of women in your country and the Arab region. Having a look at the history of post-war in Europe, sometimes the left has wanted to reivindicate the reality of women. Once we solve the economy and then we see the rest. The same that you have told us, which is still a reality in many countries. For Maja, how should the EU react facing the current attacks of Israel? Do you think it is needed to have sanctions? In what way do you think that the left, the European left, is an accomplice of what is happening? To Elena. First of all, thank you very much for all the work. You need to convince Ernest and myself to make more pressure at the government. This is happening. Not as much as we would like to. Carlos asks the question, how can we deconstruct in an effective way the hegemony narrative and raise the awareness of societies? I think that you already pointed out to some keys, and I congratulate you as having been elected as Professor Honoris Causa at the university. And have you received any type of support by the Spanish government and the European institutions? And for all of you, some other questions. The free trade agreements do not benefit the southern countries. Do you think it is possible to negotiate such agreements without making those countries lag behind? Could they be subject to the fulfillment and respect of human rights? How can we put in the front line of the debate of the European Union the fights of social movements and civil movements in the southern neighborhood? What channels do you think that exist in cooperation with civil society of both sides of the sea? Right. Ildoya, if you allow me, I will start. Because unfortunately, I have to leave in 5 minutes. Although I would love to stay here until the end, because this is a truly important topic. Talking about men in my region of the world, of course, that we have always had feminist men. I am the mother of 2 feminist children, 2 feminist boys. So I do believe in this shared responsibility that has to be also adhered to by men. They need to participate in this fight for human dignity at large. It is not a fight for women, but for all society. And there are many men that do not realize that advancing in the rights of women and improving the situation of women is something very positive for themselves. Having a partner, an accomplice in your path through life makes a real difference and makes your life much more interesting. But in Lebanon, there isn't yet a men movement that want to get involved in this much needed change. However, this could exist through education. Unfortunately, until now, there are many mothers and fathers that still educate their boys and girls in the same stereotypes, following the patterns of how a boy is supposed to be and how a girl is supposed to be. And this is not helping to generate a male profile that is more aware of the feminist struggles. And we as women cannot sit down and wait for the men to acquire such awareness. That's why we need to take matters upon our hands and do whatever we can to reach our fundamental rights. Concerning the question about the European Union, of course, they need to make pressure to have more feminist policies. But I also believe that the European Union in general has to assign more importance to human rights as a topic. Unfortunately, too many times the European Union deals with countries in the Arab world and in the Middle East that have a level of respect of human rights below bad, worse than bad. So I would like to congratulate Idoya and Maha, because you have talked about the terrible situation in Palestine at the moment. And this is nothing new. This has been happening for decades and decades. And today there is perhaps another episode of this succession of crimes. And we need to have a European Union that assigns more importance to human rights. Human rights are not secondary to known. We couldn't have a well-functioning economy nor a well-functioning policy without broad respect of human rights and the right to the dignity of each citizen, man and woman, in all countries. Thank you. Thank you, Humana. Maha.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't unmute. With respect to the question about the EU and what do they need to do, I think there are two main titles that we need to look at what the EU needs to do at the moment, but overall when it comes to the question of Palestine. The first one is to fix the narrative and adopt the correct narrative. I mean, we can't continue to play the same game in Europe, or Europe can't continue to play the same game of dehumanizing Palestinians and exceptionalizing them from the system, from the international legal framework system, and from the humanity system. We can't continue to see statements that come to say things that do not put value to the human life of Palestinians. I think that's the first key point. And the second key point as well, within the framework of narrative and approach and saying things as they are, the EU needs to also, and Europe and the international community as a whole, of course, they need to acknowledge the reality on the ground, a reality that is one of dispossession, of ethnic cleansing, as we see in Jerusalem, one of institutionalized discrimination, and one that is of oppression targeting the Palestinian people as a whole, whether in what is now the occupied Palestinian territory, Israel, and in the diaspora, in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, all the refugees in exile abroad. So I think this is very, very important, because if we say things right and if we understand what they are in reality, then we will be able to address them and take the appropriate actions. And then the second title that I think of is to act. I mean, we see so many statements coming out, some of them very good, excellent, some of them really frustrating, dehumanizing, unfair, unjustified, etc. But at the end of the day, I think what the EU needs to do is to uphold its very own principles, its very own values, its very own framework, its very own principles that talk about human rights, that talk about international law, that talk about ending impunity for serious violations and crimes. Again, Palestinians should not be an exception to this equation. So yes, when we're looking at that, when we're looking at upholding the rule of law, when we're talking about accountability, yes, we need sanctions, and we need the EU to take concrete measures immediately and to impose sanctions, whether that be it by imposing a military embargo against Israel, whether that be it by ending the association agreement and other cooperation agreements that happen with Israel, or by immediately ending and banning the settlement goods and products and services from being present in the EU market. It is unbelievable how the EU is so strong in its position in writing and theory about the illegality of Israeli settlements. But then you go around to European supermarkets, vegetable and fruit stores, and you still see products coming from settlements, and you still see products that you don't know where they're coming from exactly from Israel, very likely from Israeli settlements. So an action needs to be taken now, and again, to protect not only the international legal framework in Palestine, but as a whole. There's a lot of threat to the international legal framework, to its credibility, to its legitimacy, and we need to come together from Europe, from the US, from Palestine, from everywhere to protect that, because otherwise there's not much left to put us on a good basis around the world. And just a few other points that are not necessarily Palestine exclusive. I think there needs to also, when we're looking at the relationship between the EU and the southern neighborhood as a whole, the economic and trade cooperation, it needs to also respect the rights of the people and their sovereignty over their own resources, their natural wealth and resources. And they should make sure, in the EU, in implementing all these agreements and deals, they need to make sure that its own institutions, but also the businesses and the corporations that come with its own jurisdiction and that are operating in the MENA region or in the Mediterranean, are not exploiting resources of the indigenous peoples, of the local populations, and they're not exploiting the the people there themselves, the human resources. And I think that is that is something that we need to push for, to adopt a human rights-based approach to business and economic relationships in the Mediterranean. And we see that happen when we're talking about Latin America or other parts of the world. But unfortunately, that narrative is still missing about talking about business and human rights in the context of the EU and the Mediterranean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maha. I don't know if you have any other remarks coming from you, because we have questions. We have so many questions. You could be here until tomorrow. So if you'd like, maybe we could share a couple of final words and remarks. There are some questions that are recurring. One is about what can citizens do in order to put an end to this indifference towards the migrants' rights? How can we do this? So who is financing mafias and trafficking in arms? Why is the EU not doing anything about this flows of dirty money? Maha talked about it, about settled territories. The EU cooperates with some companies, as we know, and Maha talked about something really important, about the persecution of defenders and activists, and we see it in Spain as well with Juana Ruiz. She's been criminalized, and she is actually a symbol for human rights defenders in Palestine. And I think this ties in really well with what Maha was talking about. So I don't know if you all would like to share a couple of final words so we can close this workshop. Okay, I can start, says Ernest. Of course, Israel is a recurring topic. We've been working on this for ages. We're going to, if we get our way, NGL and the Greens, we will have a debate about this. We need to talk about differentiation policy. The EU cannot treat in the same way a product that was produced in Israel and a product that was produced in a colonized territory. And here we failed because this doesn't apply, but we strongly believe that these products cannot benefit from the trade agreements in place, the products from settlements. And I think here we need to apply pressure so that human rights are respected as well through one of the mechanisms in place. Speaking about mafias, I think Elena knows a lot more about this than I do, but I think the reason why mafias exist in the first place is because there are no legal pathways for migration. We know this, we've seen this for a long time. People need to have the possibility to migrate in a way that is legal. And if they don't do that, they will turn to mafias. So we propose to fight them with legal pathways. And then about what citizens can do. I understand people are frustrated, and we are frustrated too. We haven't been able to do much about the EU migration agenda. Having said that, I do think in the past few years we've seen some progress. We've seen that the protest movement has gained traction in Europe regarding refugee policies. We've pressured national governments and the EU, so there's a change in policy. And we've managed to do all of this despite the migration pact that was introduced that does nothing but reinforce what we already had. I think we've seen a very strong welcome in refugees movement in Spain and in Europe, and I think we've managed to change public opinion, and this is the only way forward. We need to keep being active, carrying out activities like this one, trying to raise awareness among the population, and of course doing activism. Elena right here is a shining example of what an organized citizen can achieve. So I think this is really outstanding work and work we cannot give up. We need to continue. Okay, well, now I'll take the floor because I've been mentioned. Please don't say that I know more about mafias than you do. This can be misinterpreted, and I'm just joking. I'm just playing. That's what I meant. That's what I meant. Okay, but just to set the record straight, you know more, but that doesn't mean anything. Yes, it's true that we know more about mafias because we are threatened by them. They threaten our safety. Nobody talks about who defends the defenders. We have organized criminal groups that are going after us on top of economic interests. So we have government groups and criminal groups going after us. So we need to ask, who is defending defenders if we cannot rely on states to be on our side? Somebody asked if I had received any support from the government. Unfortunately, our government is an example of what's happening at the border. We see how the Home Office is doing their own thing. And at the border, and we didn't mention this, we see the collaboration of the police that is just a reflection of the relationship between ministries, and that's what happened in my case. We have the Home Affairs Office, and then you have the rest of ministries, and they're trying to give me back the rights that were taken from me due to false accusations. So I've been deported and I've been attacked severely, myself and my daughter, and we've seen how the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Social Rights, they've tried hard to defend me and my daughter, who is a minor, and then we see that in Morocco we were told that my eviction was known by the Home Affairs Office in Spain. And that was an attack to my health. So that means Home Affairs and Foreign Affairs did not communicate. And we see that this happens at the borders as well. And that's how human rights can be violated. Idoia talked about finding an alliance within the South to go beyond this pleasure that we take in seeing pain, and we need to do our best to communicate all of this so that we can have anti-racist communication, so we can communicate the horrors of violence against women. We need to go beyond figures. We need to put stories at the center. We need to put people at the heart of the issue. And there's one thing that I think is key, and we often forget about it. And I see that the far right insists on this. They always insist on having the education regional ministries, and we need to wonder why that is. In the past, all they wanted to do, all they wanted to have is city planning, and what they want now is education. And that is key. We need to have an education to start working on these values. We can all be activists and we can all defend rights, and we can do this in our cities, in our territories. And I encourage everybody to go out and defend life, because that is what it's at stake. We need to fight for public services. And I think this is relevant wherever you are, and this can be done whatever your reality is. You can do this physically, but you can also do it online with social media. We live in a global world, so that opens new possibilities. You can send a message to the government as well, because we all vote. And we have a responsibility in how we vote as well. We are undergoing a difficult time. People are scared, and so people are voting to protect what's theirs, what they feel is theirs. We've seen it with the pandemic. They want to protect their privilege. They're not thinking about solidarity. But we need to get moving. We need to get involved and work every day. Thank you. Thank you very much, Elena. I don't know if you want to add anything, Maha?
Just quickly, I mean, I think it's very important to emphasize the need to centralize human rights at any level, at any relationship between states and businesses, between businesses and communities, etc. I think we need it as a foundation, as a baseline, and this is important in our region, but it's important in Europe and in all other regions. And hopefully we'll see more of that in the European neighborhood plans.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. And I wanted to join all the messages of congratulations to all our speakers, to Maha, you, Alma, Elena. Thank you. We will try to put together a document with all the conclusions from all our webinars so that we can share it and we can come up with priorities in our struggles. And I think today's session was really interesting. I think it's clear that human rights cannot be a bargaining chip used to deepen or freeze an economic association. They need to be at the center of their relationship. And we need to work to achieve that. Elena said it. We need to stay alert because far-right governments and parties want the education ministries, and it's really important to have brave citizens, and we all need to do the work. Without further ado, I would like to thank you for participating, and we will stay in touch. A warm hug to everybody. Thank you very much again.